Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I'm here with Joe Corallo. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Perch. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to do this retrospective, even though I'll bet there's a collective groan from a lot of people when they first see this. So
Yeah, no, this is probably going to be the most downvoted retrospective.
I would say so. I'm hoping people just at least give us a few minutes to make the case, because I think
Sure.
it's an interesting. This is an interesting series because I think a lot of people, they're viewing it through other comics at this point, and
Yeah,
that I think the problem. But
that's a problem. I don't think again, I don't want to sound gatekeepery, but I think a lot of the people who are very critical of this comic never read this comic.
I agree. I think what they've done is they've heard a lot of other people talk about it, or they've seen, knockoffs of this, and they've read that, and they're like,
Yeah,
"Oh, this is what Scott Pilgrim is like. Therefore, I hate it." And I
yeah,
think there's also for a while people were citing this as the best comic ever made of all time. There's nothing better. Forget it. And that
sure.
stuff always pisses people off.
No, absolutely. But there's also a lot of that I personally think are unfair criticisms of juvenile stuff along the lines of, oh, Scott Pilgrim's a soy boy and
Yeah.
he can't defend himself, despite the fact that he's defeating almost all of these evil X's by himself.
Right.
And is a champion in fighting in his own right. No one teaches him how to fight. Ramona doesn't teach him how to fight. Knives doesn't teach him how to fight. He's already coming in as this expertly skilled martial artist character.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Well, and he doesn't drink soy anywhere in the comic, to my knowledge.
Technically,
Oh,
he drinks the soy milk when he's does the switcheroo on Todd.
oh, there you go. Yes, it's part of it. It's part of a gag.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Fair
you
enough.
know.
There you go. Criticism's all valid. No. It is. Well, I mean, taking a step back for a moment. First off, this isn't the greatest comic ever made,
No.
but it's a good comic.
Yeah.
It's fun. I went back and read it to get ready for this. You did too. This is still holds up as an enjoyable read. It's interesting reading it now because to me at least, it further highlights all the people who have done this badly since.
Oh, oh yeah. I mean, I don't have the exact timeline in front of me, but I think when a lot of people look at this, they also think of like Cal art style and things like that, pop up, and like this, like American anime kind of approach,
Mhm.
like the chibi style and like stuff like that people talk about. A lot of that kind of stuff gets thrown around
Yeah.
when talking about this, but like in a lot of ways, and this, I don't know if this is going to sound like a compliment or not, but Brian Lee O'Malley in the early mid 2000s, when he was launching this book, it feels like kind of what Kevin Smith was doing in film in the early 90s, where people were picking this up like for a mainstream audience.
Yeah.
Because it happened to get picked up by the mainstream because this book sold really well, which we're going to get into. But it was like when people's minds were blown that they were watching Clerks and they were making Star Wars references.
Hmm.
And then they pick up this book and they're like, oh my God, there's these indie rock references. There's, they're making Zelda jokes and things like that. This is incredible. I've never read a comic like this. Not to say there weren't comics doing that before, but they didn't get the kind of traction to that generation that other comics did.
Scott Pilgrim's finest hour. This is the book signing line for Brian Lee O'Malley. This is amazing. We're coming up on the Beguiling right now. This is pandemonium. This is the best comic book ever to be released in the city of Toronto. Holy crap. The line is... I'm still not finished filming this line. There's so much of the line. Line. We're almost there.
I think there's a bunch of techniques that are used in this book around kind of bringing in some gamer culture, doing some of the flashbacks and the reels, just the way the comic is structured, that I think a lot of current comic creators who are saying they're making something similar would hate and do hate. They don't use the same methods. O'Malley does it differently. But I think that Kevin Smith analogy is actually dead on, because if you look at a lot of those original pieces, they do hold up. They're fun, but the enjoyment of them is eroded by the fact of this overpraise, overhype, and a bunch of people mimicking it so poorly.
Yeah, victim of your own success is something that I think is fair to say. But Brian Lee O'Malley, he started not. I don't think it was the first thing he ever did in comics, but he before this he worked at Oni. He was like I think he did some like backgrounds, cleanup art, like
lettering, I believe.
Yeah, he also lettering. Like he was working in production for Oni, which got him the opportunity to pitch this book. And this also goes to show you things like the road to success in comics can often be a long one. There's, no matter what anyone tells you, there's a lot of luck involved.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because I mean, he was in the right place at the right time to pitch an idea that was right for this particular publisher. Keeping in mind that Oni didn't really put books like this out beforehand. Like they were still trying to figure out what they were back in like 2004 when this was first coming out.
He had worked on Hopeless Savages, Ground Zero, which people would not think of as O'Malley. I think it was clear he did it, but that is not this kind of style. So.
No. And before Scott Pilgrim, what was it? He did that one other
Lost at Sea.
Yeah, Lost at Sea, which did not go over very well.
No. It's funny actually. It didn't sell. I think it made it more of a struggle for him to get Pilgrim done. As I recall, if he was seeing interviews of his, he talked about how that almost set it back a little bit. Now with his success, Lost at Sea is selling quite well, but it's all because he made his name with Pilgrim.
Yeah, and it took till it was at least like volume 3, I want to say, before it was getting any traction at all. He was basically struggle. He was a struggling artist for a bit. It took it was like the 4th graphic novel he did with the 3rd volume of Scott Pilgrim before I think he really started turning a profit. Yeah.
And Scott Pilgrim took 6 years to make as well, which, again, to the narrative I think people have put out there of the Cal Art style and kind of this whole environment around this type of book, there's this perception that it's done over a weekend. There's not a lot of work involved, and maybe that sometimes I think that is true, sometimes it's not. But this book took a lot of time to make, and again, when you go through the pages, it isn't the Cal Art style. It's a different. It's very different, and I think he actually does have a lot of detail. It all goes back to the perception I think people have of this book is by hearing about it in other places and by seeing other books that have ripped it off. But I mean, he puts a lot of detail into the backgrounds and everything else. It's
the backgrounds are mostly photo referenced. He went and took pictures of a lot of these places, and there's excruciating detail that goes into the backgrounds to contrast with these sort of cartoony characters that are in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely not something that I think people think of when they think of this type of book. So anyway, I think the other piece that I heard, so maybe this is just me, but I've always been a big fan of Rumiko Takahashi. Mm-hmm. I absolutely loved a lot of her work. Yorosei Yatsura was I was a big fan of that for many years. And then in particular, Mason Aikoko, mm-hmm. which this book feels a lot like. And I think Brian Lee O'Malley has credited Takahashi with a lot of the inspiration for what he did. And they definitely, there's a feeling of similarity with these books.
Absolutely. There's obviously a lot of manga influence. It seems like a bit of a primary influence here. Mm-hmm. In addition to, and it's hard not to think of something when you see something like Lost at Sea, or you think of stuff like Mermaid Saga. Yep. Perhaps not that the stories are similar, but you can kind of see that, it just pops into my mind when I think of that stuff. But he briefly, not briefly, but he was down in like LA for a few years, and his roommate is very much like the Wallace character from Scott Pilgrim.
Yep.
So there's a lot of his own life that goes into this, which I think you find often is a trend when you're talking to creators with powerful work, that they usually are able to be like, well, this thing actually happened to me, or this is part of my life that I incorporated into the book.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Woo! And to her right is Mr. Brian Lee O'Malley. Can I get Scott Pilgrim up here? All the Scott Pilgrims, get on up here. Who we got? We have an assortment of Scott Pilgrims.
I don't know. I think this thing gets miscategorized a lot as slice of life, although even O'Malley said that he's going for that vibe, but it's not. I don't know. This is why I look at Takahashi a lot as the influence, because you'd get these very common scenarios mixed with very absurd scenarios.
Yeah.
And, it's not just the evil boyfriends and the fights. I mean, this whole thing has got strange dream sequences and weird cuts and all this kind of stuff. It has a very strange environment. I mean, it is the absurd mixed with common.
Yeah, there's why am I blanking on what it's called? But there's subspace. Yeah. It's there's the subspace that goes through Scott's head, which is where he initially meets Ramona, and they have that in the movie as well. But that is so bare bones explained, makes no sense, and you just sort of go with it. And it seems like that's one of the things where I don't even know if I'm criticizing it or not, because on the one hand, what's happening? And on the other hand, if you explained it, it would probably be a horrible explanation and drag the whole thing down.
Right.
So,
What's good, I think, is he knows. I mean, to his credit, I think he knows what to explain and what to just leave as being weird.
Yeah.
And and I promise it'll be the last comparison I make to Takahashi, but this is very similar to kind of Ranma 1/2 and this idea of you've got these cursed water pools that turn people randomly into animals. And I mean, what does this all mean when it makes no sense, but any kind of further explanation or backstory would wreck the whole concept. So you just leave it alone and just let it be a weird element to the series. And this comic is filled with that.
Oh yeah. Ramona's basically a bag of holding where she can have giant mallets and things like that in it. Lots of little stuff like that. Very stylistic,
Yes.
a cartoony stylistic kind of stuff where it's usually video game references, but there's also some indie rock kind of references. I think everyone at this point who's familiar knows that Scott Pilgrim is a Plumtree song. He was a big fan of the band Plumtree, which is part of where this all came from. He had done posters for Plumtree before this book happened. So,
do you think so? There is a lot of gamer culture kind of in this whole thing, but this is another case where we've kind of been hit over the head with it. Back when this comic came out, which was 2010. I think it was 2010.
That was when the last volume came out. It was through every volume once a year through what was it? 04, and you will see this. Interesting things to note is the world changed a lot between 2004 and 2010 when the last book came out, to the point where just interesting notes are the characters use the R word in all the volumes except the last volume. They stop.
Yeah.
And that's kind of following that trend of where, it became less and less acceptable. And then I think by that last volume, they sort of cut out using that word entirely. I think you also see there's certain gay jokes and things like that I don't think
that dwindles out.
Yeah, they start dwindling some of these things out. So that's part of what makes it interesting seeing this book go across those particular 6 years.
Yeah, the art style shifts a little bit as well. He starts using some different techniques around the outlines and just there's some parts that are definitely different.
Yeah, I think some of the action towards the end too is a lot more explosive.
Yeah,
but it's interesting because again, it's that mix of slice of life where you might have a few pages where people are sitting in a coffee shop talking about their feelings, and then it'll be like 10 pages of pretty big panels or splash panels of Scott, and Matthew Patel or Lucas Lee or someone or Roxy just punching each other.
Yeah, he's pretty, and again, it goes back to the art style. I mean, I'm looking at some pages here, and there's a very, very detailed building and a lot of complexity, and then you get to a panel where the focus is going to be on the character, so you get rid of all that. It's just, he does a good job blending the art from panel to panel and using the space pretty nice. I mean, I think that he just has a good way that he structures and flows this book. It's one of those cases where it's a relatively tight product that I think people have seen maybe a panel or two and not actually read the book and perhaps judged it very harshly as a result.
Yeah, and there's other little things too, like for anyone who might be familiar with the movie and didn't read the books, the relationship between Scott and Knives is definitely more intimate in the books, but that's their relationship's mostly delved into in like the first 2 books,
right? And
then it's sort of we really transition to Ramona. I think he breaks up with Knives in the second book.
Yep.
And yeah, so you have that going on, and then by the time they get to the movie, they don't kiss or anything like that. Really, like not like passionately, but they kiss passionately and things like that. And in the books, like Scott looks, it's cartoony, and Scott's like, "Whoa, what's happening?" kind of stuff going on, but it's still like sloppy kissing and stuff like that you don't see in the movie. And again, I think that also plays to a lot of the changes we were going through in what's acceptable and what's not, and the idea of having Michael Cera at that point in his career making out with a girl who we're supposed to believe is 17 was probably not okay.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny because the movie I know I'm probably making everybody confused and hate it, but the movie is also not bad. I'm not the biggest Michael Cera fan, but I came to him from Arrested Development. I love that show, so I get enough of kind of that feel to it. I think they do reasonable job of kind of recreating this comic, but to the credit of a lot of people who hate even the very mention of Scott Pilgrim, the conversations around the book and around the movie are often so obnoxiously terrible. I'd hate it too. It's just you have to turn all that stuff off and actually read the source material.
Yeah, although I do think compared to sort of the direction hyperbole went since 2010, I would, I'd kill for those days when the hyperbole was only like it was in 2010 and not today.
God, if this book had come out in 2021, we would have been it would be just the worst.
Oh, absolutely. But, part of the other thing too is a lot of people who are upset about this book and all of that are not upset about this book existing is the wrong word, but it's just like annoyed that it exists and thinks it's terrible. Are also a lot of people that are very particular on like the numbers and are quick to point out that certain books don't sell. That is not the case here.
Yeah. So this book, to your point, so this book has sold ridiculously well to the point of, I think I've seen I've got a couple of different articles here. We'll put some numbers up, but it's just, this book is one of the top 10 graphic novels of the decade. in terms of mainstream sales. In fact, I think I'm seeing different articles here, and there's some that cite it as the third best selling, which fits. And I mean, it does. In terms of raw sales, this thing stands up there with Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and others in terms of books that are crossed over into the mainstream, have sold very well, continue to sell well, and are, I mean, there's a lot of current graphic novels, current comics that are being put out that come nowhere close to the trade sales of this thing today.
Oh yeah. When the 6th volume came out, which was around the time the movie came out, which was also around the time the video came out with the Nana Monoguchi soundtrack, and like this movie came out with, you know, a solid cast, a lot of people that were known quantities, you know, and who have gone on to be in a lot of movies since then. You know, they actually, I think people will mostly know the character of Lucas Lee from those 2 Fantastic Four films.
Yep.
Yeah. The Human Torch. He was the Human Torch in those movies. But you know, it's the synergy here, though, is this Scott Pilgrim is literally what every single person breaking into comics since 2010 has wanted. They want a massively successful series of graphic novels that get adapted into a movie by a director as, like, you know, with it as Edgar Wright, and they want a hip retro video game to go with it. Like, that's literally everyone's dream come true.
And it's worth noting, nobody's dream has come true.
No.
Yeah.
However, the dream here, I mean, there are articles and all of that go over the fact that when Volume 6 came out, it immediately sold out of its initial 100,000 print run.
Yep.
And was rushed to an additional 50,000 print run. If you put that graphic novel, not a floppy, that graphic novel, even back in 2010, I imagine at 100,000 copies, it would have been a top 10 selling floppy the month it came out.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Because I just went through it. The sales of Scott Pilgrim, if you remove the anniversary issues and the 25-cent issue, they exceeded The Walking Dead by a hearty margin, actually.
Yeah, it's so much. It was just so successful by the time they did that rushed reorder of 50,000 copies, all 6 books combined had moved 1 million units.
Yeah.
You know, and it's all done, you know, by Brian Lee O'Malley. He had assistants and other people working on it, but that's all, those royalty checks are all going to him.
Yes, exactly.
You know, for those million books sold. So, and since then they've done, you know, the hardcover, colorized versions. They've recently put out another, like, 2-in-1 versions. So it's the 3 books instead of 6. They keep pumping these. They keep finding new ways to make money off this. If you went to a con back when cons existed, even in 2019, if you were at a con that Oni was at, Scott Pilgrim's prominent.
Yeah.
You know, and this, a property that there hasn't been new material for in 10 years, was still a prominent thing they pushed at conventions.
To put it in some perspective, you were kind enough to kind of pass the link along, and just citing the selling list of Amazon. The only thing that's beat Scott Pilgrim in the last 2 years consistently across, the different months is Watchmen and the Marvel Encyclopedia that is tied into the MCU. Those are the only 2 that it's beaten all the rest in terms. Yeah. And today, this is 10 years later, these collected editions. And like you say, you go to Amazon right now, they've got what looks like dozens of different versions of this book out to buy. It's nuts. The video game was just re-released about a month ago on the Switch. It sold 25,000 physical copies, which was more than double what they thought it would make for a re-release. This is a new game.
Yeah.
And so the sales are there, but as you mentioned, it is the dream of everyone to try and replicate this, and yet nobody has.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I mean, like when we think of like rock star creators, a lot of people think of, like your Robert Kirkman's at,
Mhm.
his prime, and Mark Miller's, people like that.
Mhm.
We went through and we found, video footage of signings that these are lines wrapped around city blocks.
Yeah.
These are packed bookstores
Yeah.
of people who are desperate to meet Brian Lee O'Malley. None of the movie people are there. This isn't like, oh, Michael Cera and Edgar Wright are here, and oh, by the way, we found Brian Lee O'Malley at a coffee shop and dragged him over here. These were people who were there specifically for Brian Lee O'Malley. They were happy the movie was coming out. They were excited to go see it, but they wanted to meet Brian Lee O'Malley, and that is unique.
Very. No, there's some stories here about some cons that O'Malley was at and Stan Lee was at, and they note that O'Malley had a longer line than Stan Lee. And I know there's probably, again, a bunch of people hearing this that are groaning heavily at that, but
Yeah.
consider, I mean, it's this guy, relatively small amount of things he's produced, but it shows you how ridiculously popular this was at the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's in many cases, not to keep harping on this point, but it is much like in many cases Dark Knight Returns.
Mm-hmm.
This series would become responsible for a lot of very annoying knockoffs.
No, it would be, and Brian Lee O'Malley himself would go on to do more work from here. Seconds, which actually is probably my favorite work of his.
I agree. I like Seconds better than I like Seconds much better than Scott Pilgrim.
It's a little more like, it feels more like a Miyazaki film. It's a little more of like a fairy tale kind of take. And here's the thing: everyone who would already hate Scott Pilgrim, if you tell them like, oh no, Seconds is even better, it's like a Miyazaki film with a woman who works in a restaurant, they would be like, go to hell.
Yeah, that's exactly what they would say. Yes,
but no, it's phenomenal, and that's actually when I got to meet Brian Lee O'Malley. During his like book tour for Seconds. This was a book tour for a book that had nothing to do with Scott Pilgrim,
right?
And I was in a packed Barnes and Noble where you had to get it was either you had to hold a ticket or get a wristband. It might have been both. And, it was one of those like big signings where it's like, you can only, you have to purchase the book and you can only get like one or two additional items. I think one additional item signed. I had a friend with me who was only getting the book signed and got another copy of Scott Pilgrim for me signed. But it was like a talk and then like this like massive line to get up to Brian Lee O'Malley to get him to sign not Scott Pilgrim.
Yeah.
Like there are examples, a lot of examples of creators who have put out a monumental book. You can't get them to show up when they put out something that has nothing to do with the property they like.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, O'Malley definitely had that kind of draw. He does have another book he's been working on for a while, this Worst World, which that's been going for 2 or 3 years. Well, no, this is in 2016. He said this thing is coming, and we still don't know when. But
yeah, I mean, he was working on Snot Girl at Image.
Yep.
And then he has this other thing. I mean, he is one of the rare examples of an indie rising star who put out one book and like technically, depending on how he wants to live his life, probably doesn't have to do more work.
No, yeah, the royalties alone off of what he's set.
Yeah,
he's in a good place. But actually, to that point, you also don't see him running around on social media acting like a crazy person either. He just kind of enjoys money.
No, he's barely on social media, as far as I've noticed, and also, unlike a lot of other people, like he's done with Scott Pilgrim. He's never teased that we're going to get more Scott Pilgrim. He's a lot of similar creators or people in that situation would be far too tempted to go back and keep mining their IP until it's worthless.
Yep.
He's not doing that.
We'll get a prequel out there. We'll do another series focused on one of the supporting characters. It's, what's Stacy Pilgrim up to? I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's interesting. You look at this book, you get a lot of, it breaks down a lot, I think, the misconceptions people have of it. There is a lot of detail in this book. There's a lot of complexity in the art. You do have a lot of restraint from the creator who isn't just going back and mining it. You have a lot of things that I think buck the rules. What's curious to me is, why did so many people try and copy this but miss all the things that seem to work?
I think part of that is people like Scott Pilgrim, because it hit all those notes. They weren't looking for not Scott Pilgrim. They found Scott Pilgrim and they were like, this is my jam. And there was a there's this feeling of authenticity that I think came from it. Like, it was very clear that Brian Lee O'Malley was very passionate about the games and indie bands he was referencing. You can't fake that stuff. And people try to fake that stuff, or they try to make out the things they like to be cool when they're not.
Yeah.
And it hit right at that right moment. It wasn't super cool to be making like Zelda jokes and Super Mario jokes before this in comics. You didn't really see that. This sort of changed that. It made, like, the problem is it made everyone think, oh, it's cool to be like this kind of nerd now. I'm going to let my nerd flag fly. Yes. But once you've seen it done, you can't replicate the first time you felt like you connected to a work like that. Yes. You can't replicate in another movie and feel exactly the same way in Clerks when they're arguing about, contract workers on the Death Star and like that level of a conversation. You can't, have your second time around in that, or your second time around in, Mallrats with like Brody talking to Stanley and that conversation. Like, you get those moments and then that's it. Like, other people try to do those sort of things, and how many indie films have we seen or not seen that like heavily aped off of everything that people like Kevin Smith were going for? It just doesn't work. And that's sort of the same thing that happens with Scott Pilgrim. I mean, we've seen a few similar kind of successes, but not to the same level. Like Brian Clevenger had that webcomic 8-bit theater, which came out a little before this.
Yep.
And that I really loved. I was reading that as it was coming out. I think I became aware of it very few episodes in, maybe within the first dozen or so episodes of that webcomic coming out, and I really loved it. And he went on to do Atomic Robo, and he has seen a level of success from that. It pales in comparison to Scott Pilgrim.
Right.
But, you have those sort of things, going on. I don't think a lot of the people that have come since Scott Pilgrim have achieved even like Brian Clevenger's level of success. And he's great. If people aren't familiar with him, Atomic Robo, 8-bit theater and stuff like that, definitely check that out, because that's also equally kind of quirky and nerdy, but in a different kind of nerd. It's like, that's where you're talking like Edison and Tesla kind of nerd.
It's an interesting book because the gamer references seem authentic. A lot of the stuff that came later seemed less so. You're right. You're exactly right. And a lot of the things that were done when he was making this book, Zelda references and one-ups and everything else, nobody was doing that. It definitely was alt nerdy kind of content. And but I'm imagining a lot of people who came to this book came to it after it was popular, after they had probably seen a couple of the knockoffs, and then it's annoying at that point. You don't have that same experience. I think a lot of parents are going through this right now as they're desperately trying to get their young children into Harry Potter, and they're discovering that their kids like it like not even close to what they thought.
Yes.
Years ago, it's like, oh, this isn't good. Some things are just meant for the time period they're in, and this feels like kind of one of those. Like you have to. I think you'd still enjoy it if you're coming into it new, but you have to ignore a lot of what's going on in the background sense.
Yeah, I mean, this also came out around the time, like, what was it? There were some other web comics. Like, web comics were the only thing you could get anything like this at this point.
Right.
You had, like, Mega Tokyo was another web comic around this time that had some gamer kind of references. I think that we were still fairly early, but I think it existed for a little bit, was Penny Arcade.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But again, all of this was webcomic stuff. This wasn't like a manga type book you could pick off the shelf. Like this, it engaged a wider audience,
right,
and a different audience. And you had like other nerd culture stuff. Like really, like this is where it was really coming and rising. Like I think this is also right around when we had like the rise of like Felicia Day and the Guild.
Yep.
You know, stuff like that. Like this was an interesting phenomenon that I think Scott Pilgrim, you know, came out of and excelled, and in a lot of ways, you know, outside of maybe something like Penny Arcade, because we can talk about the PAX conventions and how successful they are. But in terms of publishing, in terms of creating a franchise, Scott Pilgrim is the one that really, you know, stands above it all.
I can't quite put my finger on it, but I think Brian Lee O'Malley, much like Rumiko Takahashi, they have the ability to tap into pop culture in a way that other comic artists don't. They're still telling their story, but they are able to be maybe savvy enough about what's going on in the marketplace he did successfully hook on to a lot of other things that are kind of bubbling under the surface and getting popular, and harness it, kind of leverage it. And I think that's where it was so successful, because it was able to, it was a mass market appeal book. At the same time, I think that Scott Pilgrim works for Scott Pilgrim. It works for this type of book. What's been perhaps frustrating, and I think, again, probably the source of a lot of irritation from people when they think about this property, is that this style is not what works for, say, Marvel Comics or DC. You don't take the Scott Pilgrim style and say, let's do Batman with this. It doesn't fit. Or it takes it takes a very skilled writer to do that in a very different type of story.
Yeah, that's not to say, you know, they didn't try a bunch and fail miserably. I remember it was, I want to say the Gillen McClevey Young Avengers #1, they had the Brian Lee O'Malley variant that they really pushed. Yep. And even for the omnibus, they put out, like, it might have been the direct market variant was the Brian Lee O'Malley cover.
Yep.
And, you know, Young Avengers, despite the fact that I enjoyed that run and I enjoy those characters, is not Scott Pilgrim. And if you enjoy Scott Pilgrim, you're not necessarily going to enjoy Young Avengers. They're very different books. And I think that was a real misfire on Marvel's, you know, part. Despite the fact that I enjoyed both books, that's not like, you're not, I mean, as much as I enjoyed those things, like that book didn't sell a fraction of anything close to what Scott Pilgrim did.
Absolutely. I think the title people bring up a lot is Squirrel Girl, because I think even some of the creators have pointed to Scott Pilgrim as being kind of the inspiration behind that book, and kind of a lot of the sense of the humor and things they were going for. But again, I just think there's too many reasons why that's not going to work over there. Squirrel Girl aimed at a different audience. It's aimed at a different market. It's an ongoing. There's just, you can go down the list of a lot of reasons why it's a completely different property.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if, for example, you tried Squirrel Girl, you disliked it, and you heard, oh, this got its inspiration from Scott Pilgrim, try and erase that from your brain and pick up Scott Pilgrim and try it again.
Sure.
Because you will discover, and it's actually fascinating, you discover a very, very different product and a different story and a different feel. And I think you're kind of hurting yourself if you keep those tied together. You're missing out on some things.
No, absolutely. But another part of this too is a lot of times we talk about how, you know, like Joss Whedon dialogue
Yeah.
has like, you know, like, oh, he ruined comics forever because everyone's aping off of Joss Whedon. I would say they're not. They're aping off Brian Lee O'Malley and Scott Pilgrim.
A lot more. Yeah. I think it's a little both. I think the
Sure.
quippy, or maybe they're just doing Joss Whedon poorly, which is quite possible.
Sure.
Right? And arguably they're doing Scott Pilgrim poorly too. I think.
Yeah. I think it's the stuff that's irritating people more is more aped off Scott Pilgrim. Because we can also make the argument that Joss Whedon's writing was really just aping off of Peter David. Like if you read Peter David's Hulk and the original X Factor run, he was doing all that quippy stuff well before Whedon. And, you know, and I think if you want to see that done right, more recently, you check out Peter David's X Factor Investigations, because there's a lot of fun, quippy dialogue in that, but it's good.
Yeah.
So, but I think what annoys people is less. It's not quite Whedon dialogue. Like one of the lines I think that, you know, because it was in the movie, that people think of when they think of Scott Pilgrim is when, you know, when Kim says, you know, if your life had a face, I would punch it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of dialogue that's like leaked into, I think, a lot of what people are trying to do in indie comics, and even some people in Marvel and DC. That kind of stuff is upsetting people.
Mm-hmm.
As
good reading with good reason. It doesn't fit in a lot of cases.
Yeah, people don't want to see, you know, like Falcon say, "Cap, if your life had a face, I would punch it," or things like that. And we see that kind of stuff going on, and it just doesn't work.
I think the other thing that I've seen copied a lot, which again, it's these captions, these character introductions that are kind of cutesy. They put, you know, Scott Pilgrim, world's greatest prep cook, and mess, you know, and it's that kind of
yes.
stuff. I do absolutely hate that. In other books, it worked for Scott Pilgrim because it fits the book that O'Malley is doing. It fits the feel of it. It's absolutely obnoxious when you're throwing that into Avengers, I think is the problem.
No, it is, because, you know, and this goes to the tone of the book, which is really important. The tone of Scott Pilgrim is a fun, lighthearted book that has stakes. The stakes aren't if a character lives or dies. The stakes are, does Scott get with Ramona?
Right.
So you can have these goofy bits where, you know, he's, you know, like more or less murdering these evil exes, you know, hitting them and they burst into coins and haha, you're a gamer. It's gamer stuff. Yeah. And you can have that. You can have Scott have an extra life. And even though he gets killed by Gideon, he comes back and wins with the extra life. You can do that stuff because it fits the tone of the book. And it doesn't affect the stakes, because it doesn't matter if Scott lives or dies. What matters is if he gets with Ramona or not.
Sir Pilgrim! I'm Ramona's first evil ex-boyfriend.
What? Wait, we're fighting over Ramona?
Didn't you get my email explaining the situation?
I skimmed it.
It's I mean, it allows you to pass back and forth within the absurd. I mean, characters getting punched and in theory murdered and turning into coins. Yes. Meanwhile, you know, in other scenes we have people punching the highlights out of Knives' hair. I mean, there's a sense of, I think I always try and context, if you like say like Video Girl Eye, or you like a lot of the Takahashi stuff, if you like kind of this more manga that is, you know, it's relationship, but the characters turn into animals when they're doused with water. I mean, it's absurd comedy with actual stakes in it as well. And it's if you can put your mind in that place, I think it winds up being very enjoyable.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people fail. There are no actual stakes, that they just want to do something cool. And it doesn't work, and they wonder why. And it's like, because there are no stakes. Like, you know, but it has really established stakes that they make it clear, and they never lose sight of that. You are constantly reminded, not in a condescending way. You're just constantly reminded over the course of the story, Scott is trying to get with Ramona. What does he have to do? He has to get a job and be an adult. He has to beat her 7 evil exes. He has to grow as a person and understand that he needs to do things for himself and not on, he has to do them for himself and not for other people. Which again, I think is a lesson that a lot of people, when they're making fun of like a book like this or mocking this book, oh, he's not a real man and all that. It's like, I can't think of a more real man kind of lesson than you need this journey, and you need to do things for yourself, not for this woman you love, not to impress your friends or to show up this villain. You have to do it for you. And that's that. I can't think of a better kind of lesson in that sense to show that this is like really about, improving yourself,
No, for sure. It's definitely it's a growth thing for Scott. It's set amidst the context of him having to kill bad boyfriends and or ex-boyfriends. It's he's managing this relationship weird triangle of an ex-girlfriend and a potentially future girlfriend, and the girl he's involved in he doesn't really want, and there's all that kind of stuff. But it's and then these very absurd kind of races and contests and other pieces, and the fact that the vegan has superpowers. I mean, you go down the whole thing, but the journey here is Scott's. It's not about the supporting cast. I mean, supporting cast helps that journey along, and there are growth that happens there. But this is Scott's journey, and it's there's a lot of depth here. It's a perfectly solid book, and I feel like the people who really criticize this and the people who really love it often get it wrong.
I'm with you. But like, building on that point too, again, it's laser focused storytelling. We don't deviate from Scott. We don't have weird chapters or a book that just goes into the life of, Stacy or the life of, Sex Bomb. It's laser focused on Scott. Everything's through his POV. They don't, muddy up the plot where it's like, oh no, now Wallace got kidnapped and now I gotta save Wallace, but oh no, I gotta go on a date with Ramona. Like they don't muddy it up. They don't split your attention. It's laser focused. So Scott needs to accomplish these things to get to his goal.
Yeah, it is a pretty straight line. There's a lot of obviously characters and other pieces in this, and kind of the complexity of the different boyfriends and the different people in Scott's life that are irritated at him, all the rest. But it is a straight line of this story and everything that's going on with it. They spend a little bit of time with how this is impacting Knives, but again, you never deviate to a different story. You never get a completely new, a chapter that has nothing to do with Scott. It's always centered on Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're able to tell the story where we really get to know these other characters, even though it's laser focused on Scott. Yeah. Like we really get a sense of who Wallace is through purely his interactions with Scott. We don't really see him interact without Scott being there. Right. Very briefly, but like it's mostly his relationship with Scott is how we know and build up this character. And that's, sort of how it goes through the whole book is all these characters we know through their relationship, more or less with Scott. And that's just solid storytelling. Yeah,
no, I think that O'Malley deserves a lot of credit for reading the room, in the sense of being able to create something, that was because I don't think this was accidental. I think there was a lot of luck involved completely.
Sure.
How God as popular as it is. But I also think he was placing the bets smartly to give himself the best chance of this book going big. I mean, I don't think a lot of this stuff was accidental. He knew when to steer away from a lot of silly nonsense and keep focus on what he was doing and make it a very packageable book. I mean, the pitch for this book is almost dead simple. It's, Scott is trying to figure out his life, meets a girl, wants to date her. Only problem is she's got these evil ex-boyfriends he's got to defeat first. What will happen? I mean, you've got your elevator pitch in about 10 seconds for this book.
Yeah.
That's going to make it much, much easier. And that elevator pitch is not something goofy like, it's a slice of life coming of age story. Then it has tarot decks and Dungeons and Dragons and some fantasy elements, and people learn their lessons. So, Okay, I don't know what that means, but you get a sense of this story is going to deliver you a beginning, middle, and an end.
No, actually, I mean, we could horribly pitch this about it's like it's a guy and he's a loser and he wants a girlfriend and he doesn't have a job and he lives with a roommate who's gay and he's in a band and they like Zelda and like you could go ramble like that and then be like, no, pass.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
Not interested. But and again, part of the luck here is like we said earlier, this really didn't start taking off till around the third book. So Brian Lee O'Malley already had a book that was more or less a dud with Lost at Sea, and then he had two more books before the third one, which took off. Anything could have happened to stop this. Oni could have said, you know what? After the first book, we invested in you for 2 books. We're done.
Yep.
Or Brian could have said, I invested too much of my time into 2 or 3 books. I need to focus on making a living and, something that might get quicker success. So I'm going to stop making these books.
Mm-hmm.
And that easily could have also gotten us to a point where this never happened. This could have been First Seconds Battling Boy from Paul Pope.
Yes. Yes, it could have.
It easily could have, which I think is something else that people would probably compare to Scott Pilgrim superficially. Because it's, it's a young guy in these t-shirts, give him powers and stuff like that. But
do you think, because I read this originally in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I'm back and read it again in a color version. I think the black and white was better. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the black and white, obviously it's the original intention. I've read it in black and white. I've read it in color. Mm-hmm. I like both. It's whatever your preference is, whatever gets you to read the book. There's a couple of jokes that make no sense. They annotate it because Ramona makes a joke about how she changes her hair like every week, and Scott says, "Oh, I didn't notice."
Yeah, exactly. Some of the jokes don't. That's one thing I think doesn't work is some of the jokes in color fail. Yeah. That is definitely true. Yeah. Some of the stuff with Envy as well. There's just jokes about the appearance and everything else that I think are cool ways to indicate that Scott doesn't have a good handle on things. And anyway,
but I mean, it all depends on what you like. If you hate reading black and white comics, don't torture yourself by reading it in black and white. If you're a purist and you like reading black and white comics, read in black and white if you can. I've seen like what was it? I've seen Amazon reviews of the Complete Bone, like that compendium, and it's printed in the original black and white as it was intended. And you get tons of reviews being like, "No one told me this was in black and white," and stuff like that. So yeah, just yes, it's But
I think so. What about people who they haven't seen the movie? They've heard a lot of this is SJW bait, and I'm not going to watch the movie, not going to read the comic. Where do they begin? Would you suggest they try the comic first or the movie first?
I'd say the comic because the comic, is definitely less like. I mean, you don't have to deal with Michael Cera in the comic, and the comic. It's not nearly as SJW as people act like it is. It's really not. There are, again, it's this guy who's dating a girl in high school. Yes. He doesn't look good. He's not trying to be a good person. They're pretty savage about the vegan stuff. Like they really mock vegans. And
yeah. That is not a hero in the book. That's not held up.
A villain. One of the villains is a vegan, and the vegan is portrayed as being the dumbest character in the book.
Yes.
And he also there's that whole bit where, going back to what we were saying before, where he really cracks Knives in the face and knocks the highlights out of her hair. And he just says, like, I'm not afraid to punch a girl.
Yeah.
Like that's your vegan, everybody. Like,
the vegan at one point gets held up by people pointing finger guns at him, and he's dumb enough to anyway. It's I think that again, a lot of people have copied this poorly.
Yes.
A lot of this stuff has made it into books that really shouldn't fit this at all. You do get you get a lot of different characters, you get a lot of different things, but this is a fun title. It's
Yeah.
the word. The key word is it's fun. When I read this again, I'm like, I remember why I enjoyed this. This is just lighthearted and it's fun and it's some silly stuff and it's there's some really detail and complexity to the art at different times. This is enjoyable. I can't argue.
No, it's great for that stuff. It's not preachy. There's no lesson here in terms of you need to be a better member of society and do these sort of things. It's just like, just you got to be yourself and do the right thing kind of stuff. It's lessons like that. There's no preaching in terms of characters who are like getting on a soapbox or anything like that. The only kind of preaching is there are people in the book that will be like, Scott, you have to stop being such a miserable prick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
that's exactly the preaching. The women are not all intelligent. It's everybody has flaws. Ramona has flaws. Everybody is got issues. The characters, you've got multiple panels of Ramona with lots and lots of cleavage. There's just here.
Envy Adams is portrayed as not being a good person.
Yeah.
Stacy Pilgrim, you're kind of left to your own devices, like if you like her or not. She's just this kind of like nosy kind of character. Knives is, this character is like, you feel bad. She's kind of been manipulated in some ways, but they also go out of their way to show that, Knives is also at fault to an extent. Once the breakup happens, no one made her become this like stalkery kind of character. No one tried to push her to decide the best idea was to try to challenge Ramona. Like it's complicated characters.
Yeah. That's something I appreciate. Again, that I don't think gets transferred over to a lot of other books that are using this as their template. Is these characters have very, very fleshed out personalities and complexities, and they stay true to their characters. They're not just there for one note jokes. And so as people have copied this book, I think they want to just take the highlights and kind of self-insert things at different times. I don't know. I think if you give it a shot, I enjoy this book. I think it is one of the nicer things. It reminds me a lot, again, of Rumiko Takahashi. So if you remember those with fondness, this is as close as you're going to get probably to that. Definitely made a ton of money. Definitely was adapted poorly by others. But it's fun. I like this book.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. If something like Seconds sounds more your speed when we were talking about that, I'd suggest doing that instead of Scott Pilgrim.
Seconds is really quite good, especially if you liked Meiya-san Aikoko. This Seconds is really fills that need, I think.
Yeah, but I definitely would say, Scott Pilgrim's also, it's not that much of a commitment. It's 6 books or 3 now. Mm-hmm. It's so widely available. You can find them at a decent price somewhere, no matter how you want to read it. It is a phenomenon. It was a phenomenon. In terms of being more of a downer now, I don't know the next time we're going to see a creator get that big off of an original idea.
I agree. I there's nothing that's coming close to it right now, and maybe the conditions are such that it's going to be hard for it to happen.
There are some people like Kirkman who's a big name. I don't know if Kirkman could get a line like some of the lines that you might have seen earlier that we showed, or that kind of excitement at a bookstore. I don't know who has that kind of buzz at all. I don't think anyone right now has that ability who's currently doing comics with an original IP It would be one thing to be like, oh, we got James Tynion doing a signing before the Batman movie, and like we're gonna have the Twilight guy there or whatever.
Mhm.
Maybe something like that. But like for an original IP,
on their own.
we talk about how there are some really good books out there that people are doing that are original IP. And, I'm not trying to single anyone out, but I can't think of any of these bigger books where you're going to have a city block or so, wrapped around with people who cannot wait to meet Brian Lee O'Malley.
No, I mean, and definitely not for an original IP. I think Kirkman obviously has made it very big and the success of what he's done. But again, Scott Pilgrim outsold it in terms of the comic and the graphic novels.
Yeah.
At Marvel and DC, I mean, the biggest names. I mean, at Marvel, you have your Jason Aaron's, your Donny Cates, your even Jonathan Hickman. They're successful, they're popular, but they wouldn't get the kind of lines you're seeing in these videos right now.
Yeah,
not on their own. And that's with the benefit of having the X-Men behind you, or Spider-Man or the Avengers, what have you. This is something that came completely out of nowhere. No characters you knew. I mean, very, very, very popular. Very, that is kind of a downer. I don't know. I don't know if we can get this. I mean, I'm sure something like this will happen again, but the conditions are different now. I think it would be harder for this to happen.
And I think if anyone's out there listening to this and wants to break into comics and is working on their own original IP, I think it's crucial you read something like Scott Pilgrim and understand how, even if you're not doing a story remotely close to something like Scott Pilgrim, the way he's able to quickly distill characters and make people like them.
Yep.
There are people before that movie came out who are like cosplaying online, waiting to meet Brian Lee O'Malley because these characters are so fleshed out. And the way they're fleshed out is all through the lens of Scott and how they interact with him. And understanding how to do that in a comic is part of how you can stand out and be successful in this field.
So that's great advice, and I think it's very true. You may as a person really love Craven's Last Hunt. You and I both do.
Yep.
Very obviously a ridiculously different book from Scott Pilgrim, but if you're going to set out to create comics, I think you need to read. You need to read both. You definitely need to read stuff like this because of what you say. I think the ability to quickly translate a character. I think the kind of the intangible, the way to make a product that's going to be market savvy and appeal to a wide audience. O'Malley pulled it off. Again, maybe you sit here and you grit your teeth and you hate every page because it's not for you. You have to kind of look at it with a different eye of saying, why is it that he was able to make this go? Because he's been able to make this successful where nobody else is able to.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the sales, when you look at how successful this book was, it's very clear that the audience was wider than just people that absolutely already love this kind of stuff.
Right.
There is stuff in here for people who might not normally pick up these kind of books.
Absolutely. I think the audience that I think this gets stereotyped as for are buying comics right now, but those are the comics that are selling in the 5,000 to 20,000 range. This book far exceeded that. So what was different? What was he able to pull off, and why was he able to get this communicated? Because the success was happening before the movie. The movies absolutely helped, and the games and everything that followed, but this title was selling. I remember with reprints and other things, this was selling in the Civil War numbers for a book at one point.
Yeah.
And just, you got to kind of, it's not that just all the SJWs came out and bought this one book and then left. that's it's silly on the surface. I hate that term.
Absolutely. No, it's a terrible term, but yeah, if you've been putting off reading something like Scott Pilgrim and you don't quite get it or understand it, like it's an enjoyable book that understands characterization and understands how to leverage stakes appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
And again, beyond just reading it for characterization, understanding how to have your stakes matter, even if life and death doesn't matter, even if these other things don't matter.
Yeah.
You need to create stakes that people can get behind and care about what's going to happen. And right now, we're in a world with the big two where everyone is very stupid and just acts like, oh, death never mattered, when it actually did not that long ago in big two comics.
Oh, for sure.
And even though it doesn't anymore because of the constant reboots and all of that, you still have to figure out a way to have stakes that people care about. And Scott Pilgrim, again, amazing job at life and death not mattering and all these other things and doing these silly sort of bits throughout this book. But the stakes are still high.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, anything else? I recommend you go pick it up, even if you're like you absolutely positive for sure you've never read it, but you're sure it's not for you. Again, you want to work in the industry, you want to see, and I also think it's helpful to see the origin point to what a lot of people did, and as you're reading it, just keep track of how people have adapted this poorly, because that's a fun game in and of itself.
Oh, it absolutely is. I enjoyed the game. I was all in on Scott Pilgrim. I didn't get on the hype train till like the fifth book came around, when the fifth book was out. It happens. You can't always be there at the ground floor. But I saw the movie in theaters. I think 4 times. I only paid twice, but I had all different friends who wanted to go see it, and ended up going multiple times. I bought the game when that came out, downloaded it and played that a bunch. It was something I played with a lot of friends. It was a good time for me, and good memories. It makes me, sad that I'm talking about these as memories, because, 2010, 2011 doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it was.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine, but it's just like, wow, this is really like, really something.
I enjoyed this. I legitimately enjoyed this series. But I remember my first reaction seeing this was, why are they ripping off Yatsura? Which takes you back to 78. So there you go. You can be...
Yeah, there you go.
You can go older and more pathetic, as I have. Anyway,
Yep.
well, good stuff, Joe. Thank you very much for walking through this. Again, I hope people give it a shot. And yeah, what do you want to do next? What kind of book do you want to walk through next?
No problem. There's a few things, because this was one of the early ones we talked about doing, and it just took us months to get here. I know we've talked about New Teen Titans. We're going to have to do that at some point soon.
We have to do Titans.
I still want to do Judge Dredd: The Cursed Earth.
Yes.
That's a really good one. There's a few other things that I know are going to come up. I'm trying to think if some other people have brought some other issues up
for some of the Roy Thomas work over at Marvel, the both Spider-Man and Cap runs, I think.
I feel like Englehart. I'm a big Englehart fan. I might, Avengers Defenders War, that being the first like real crossover.
That's a great idea.
I think would be, that I think would be a lot of fun. I definitely want to go over some of the, Mark Grunwald's Cap, and that's another guy that is, oh my God, it's just like, people always, you talk about Chris Claremont, X-Men. We also have to do Fall of Mutants. The Fall of the Mutants we've talked about doing for a while. We have to pull the trigger on that, and just
that's an easy one. That's a nice quick one to do. So
yeah, so we definitely have to do that. But Grunwald being on Cap for about 11 years and editing it before that even. It's hard to find someone who had as long of like a consistent run on any character in like since like the Bronze Age and forward, other than maybe like Carrie Bates on like The Flash. But I think Mark wrote more issues of Cap than Carrie Bates wrote of The Flash. I'd have to double check.
It's close.
Yeah, it's
It'd have to be really, really close, if not. Yeah, those all sound great. So I'm looking forward to those. Thanks everybody for listening, and yeah, we'll do this again soon.
sounds great.